Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring intuition in business. With me in the studio is Dr. Weston Agor, an individual who has been spearheading the introduction of intuitive methods into business organizations. He is a professor of public administration at the University of Texas in El Paso. He is the founder and director of the Global Intuition Network. He's also the president of a consulting firm called ENFP, specializing in intuition in business. He's the author of 2 books, Intuitive Management and the Logic of Intuitive Decision Making, and he's the editor of an anthology called Intuition in Organizations. Welcome, Weston.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be with you. I think businesses must be fascinated with the prospects of intuition because they see it as a shortcut somehow, as a quicker way to get things done. Do you think that's the hook?
Yeah, I think that's part of the hook. I think it's also part of the reflection of the change in the environment that we have now that's clearly going to lead into the next 20 years of rapid change and crisis and unfolding of events that in the past were much more stable or more predictable. Mm-hmm. And so the more traditional management techniques are becoming less and less useful. In many ways they're useful for a picture of yesterday rather than what's coming tomorrow. So the capacity to pick up the first faint tap of a new trend becomes a critical skill now in the next 20 years.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting that you think of intuition as a new trend, and it certainly is in business, but I suppose if we look at anthropology and the development of humankind, intuition as a brain skill is something that is probably highly cultivated in indigenous cultures around the world.
Yes, I think that's true, but at the same time, one of the advantages of the last 20 years is the breakthroughs in terms of hard science knowledge about how the brain functions. Mm-hmm. And as people have been talking of the decade of the brain, part of what's been taking place of late and has inspired interest, I think, in the practitioner community is the recognition that there are new things that we know and are learning about the brain that we didn't know just 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. And you can kind of be summarized that in the last decade we've learned more about how the brain functions than we have in the history of man, and we know less about how the brain functions than we do about how to get to the moon. So the upside potential for productivity is clearly there, and organizations are very interested in that potential.
And I would imagine that we're at a time in history where businesses realize that the people who work for them are their greatest asset, and if they can enhance the mental functioning or the use of that incredible computer that each person
Right.
has, the biocomputer of the brain, that it becomes imperative. That is, if they don't do it, they may lose ground.
That's correct, and it becomes a focus not only of how do you tap the potential of individuals in organizations, but to tap the potential of all the individuals together as an organizational entity. Mm-hmm. So it's an individual and an organizational approach and focus that becomes critical.
Yeah. At the same time, I'm guessing that a lot of organizations are very skeptical about this approach. There's something too mystical, too undefined, or magical about it. Do you run into that?
A great deal.
Mm-hmm.
And part of what I find useful in working with organizations is to begin with some of the symbols that they're most comfortable with. Let's say in workshops where if you're dealing with engineers, they might be most comfortable with something like a typical paper and pencil test that they can kind of immediately get into and see their own individual results rather than talking about definitions of what intuition is or work on a real live problem that they want to solve that day. I often we'll ask at the outset, what is a problem that you're trying to deal with, that you've been wrestling with, that you haven't got apparent answers to, and by the end of that day, the test of the success of this workshop is going to be, have we solved that problem, or have we got some new avenues that you hadn't thought of before?
Mm-hmm. Well, it sounds like what you're saying when I hear you describe this work is that one of the most fundamental aspects of intuition is self-knowledge.
I think it's self-knowledge in two ways: self-knowledge at an individual level and at an organizational level. Very often knowledge exists in an organization, but it's not listened to. So there's an individual listening that's necessary, and then there's an organizational listening that's necessary, which means that in part you've got to encourage and establish processes at an organizational level also to listen to the individuals in your organization, no matter what their job title or years of experience. Sometimes some of the most intuitive insights come from people who are doing janitorial work, and they themselves may not have thought of themselves in those terms. So it's helping them come to terms with their own capabilities and abilities, and also helping the organization be willing to search for that talent wherever it may be.
It's as if that some people in an organization who have a tendency maybe to take charge and take a leadership role may not necessarily always be the most intuitive people.
Absolutely. In fact, I think one of the fascinating things is that you can't even talk about an intuitive process in kind of a monolithic way either. That, for example, one of the critical things that's practically useful is to know what type of intuitives you have. In some cases, you have extrovert intuitives who are excellent at selling and working and interrelating with people. And then on the other hand, you might have an introvert intuitive who, unless you know that that's the person you have there, they're likely to have the answer, but they're not going to volunteer the answer themselves. So from a management perspective, it's critical for the manager to learn and know what kind of talent they have, what type, and kind of where is it located, and how do you put it together so that the pieces will fit and that you can encourage the talent to surface so that the organization can take advantage of it.
You describe in one of your articles an exercise that you do with people in corporations where they have to imagine themselves to be stranded on a desert island. Can you tell us about that?
Well, one of the things that I find very useful is that people, well, first of all, very often people don't think of themselves as being intuitive necessarily. And sometimes very gifted intuitives have just kind of tripped across the skill, and they really haven't gone through any developmental process to encourage the skill even further. So there's a lot further that they can go. And one of the ways to get them practically in touch with that is to give them a real problem, like desert survival. You're stranded in a desert, you're far from civilization, you have several objects that you have for survival, and you have to prioritize which ones you're going to keep and which ones you're going to throw away, and how the person looks at the task, whether they see the strategic solution, which is making the decision whether to stay or leave. Very often people will say, well, to get out of this situation, what we've got to do is kind of take off. So one of the objects that they've got is a map. Well, that's not the strategic direction to take. The strategic direction to take is to stay put and think about how you're going to signal people or persons that might be coming around, or to lengthen your survival time by using objects in ways that they originally weren't created for. So the capacity to vision a purpose of an object other than what it was originally intended for becomes critical, and that's your visioning skill, your imagination skill, all part of the ingredients of an intuitive process. So very often what I find is that people have been typecast in an organization like they've got a job title of X, Y, and Z. Maybe let's say it's secretary. In fact, I've really enjoyed running this exercise on military bases, because very often what will happen is let's say a male captain will get up and say, well, you be the recording secretary, because and that's kind of the role that he sees the person in, and very often they're the ones that have the best answers, and they're just absolutely shocked by the fact that here they've had desert survival training, all kinds of other training, and here's someone who hasn't had that kind of training and has an intuitive sense of the way to go, and that becomes one of the critical lessons. not typecasting, and also learning, well, they're not typecasting, the individual also getting in touch with their own talent, and then systematically putting this together in an organizational setting.
And this particular exercise I found quite interesting because it involves an opportunity for you in the course of the exercise to measure both the intuitive abilities of the individuals participating and the way the group is able to interact to take advantage of that.
Right, and I talk about this whole process as what I call brain skill management, that what is critical is to find the talent wherever it is in the organization and then sequence it in the decision-making process so that the strengths of the intuitive are at the appropriate stage, and often in the idea generation, for example, or what's often referred to as imagineering versus engineering. And then on the other hand, being aware that there are shortcomings that intuitives have also, or weaknesses, if you will, tendencies, such as being careless with detail and follow-through, and that they're best used then at the discovery and new idea generation stage, but not at the implementation stage, because they're more likely to make errors there, or they're not as interested in the implementation part of the process. They're more concerned about solving the problem. Once they think they've got it solved, they want to go on to another problem rather than working out all the details and of what would be very critically necessary also in the whole process in any organization.
Now, I get another sense from your study of intuitive individuals in organizations that in addition to the importance of intuition at the beginning, the idea generation stage, it's also important at the very end, after everything has been kind of reviewed analytically, to make sure it really feels right.
Right, absolutely. Some of the research that I've done with highly successful and intuitive executives, I went back to a group that scored in the top 10% nationally, and I said, okay, if you're so intuitive and you're in such key positions, why is it that you're not always right? And they came up with some very useful clues on the technology, if you will, of the intuitive process. And they have tools that they use to know when they're going right and when they're going wrong. And part of it is when to follow that intuitive process. What kinds of cues do they get that make them feel uncomfortable? Trying it on, for example, overnight, or and also finding that there are many different ways that individuals use, and so you have to also find your particular way, the light and the button that works for you. So one executive might put on an idea at night and sleep on it, whereas another might do just the opposite and wash it out of their mind totally, and then resurrect the problem again totally new in the morning and say, now does this still feel right? Is this the way I want to go?
I also seem to recall in this study that these executives found that they made mistakes more often from failing to listen to their intuitions than from acting on an intuition and being led astray.
That's correct. That's correct. I think there's kind of two lessons there. One is learning to pursue your intuitive process and listen to it. Become sensitive to what particularly works for you also, which means you have to try a lot of different things and find what does work for you and what doesn't work for you. But further, that you also need to encourage that search at an organizational level, also in group form, so that you may have, for example, in a work group, 5 different highly intuitive people, and the process that you put together as a whole is going to be somewhat different than what you put together for yourself individually when you're working on the process. And so that the organization needs to work at both of those levels.
And I suppose part of the tension there is that whereas an individual has the freedom to be whimsical, to be creative, to be intuitive, organizations are typically structured according to hierarchies, according to logic, according to rules and formats and protocols and regulations that typically don't allow room for intuition.
Yeah, I think that has been true in the past, but I think now what's increasingly taking place is some of the more traditional organizational structures have become less and less useful. And it's consistent with the growing importance of the intuitive process in decision making, so that what's needed now is not throwing out some of the more traditional management techniques, but rather integrating those techniques with the intuitive processes. And that means increasingly more flexible organizational settings, task force types of settings, working in contract settings, part-time settings, cross-cultural perspectives. So the buzzword is flexibility, if you will, and adaptability rather than rigidity and high degrees of structure. It also means that job title and some of the more traditional symbols are less useful, and the whole concept of leadership becomes less of kind of commander and more of a coach, mentor, facilitator, working in harmony with others, encouraging a group process to emerge rather than someone kind of barking out commands that others would follow.
Do you run into situations where people who have traditionally held positions of power feel threatened by this, the loss of their comfortable role?
Yes, I think so, and I think that's part of I think we've got a generational change in leader. The leader of the period of 20 and 30 years ago, I think what it takes to be a leader tomorrow is a totally different individual, and therefore if the more traditional, let's say macho type leadership style, if that individual doesn't learn to adapt, they're not going to be the type that's going to emerge in this next 20 and 30 years.
Now, Weston, we've been talking so far about intuition without really defining it, and I'd like to be a little more precise now, because I sense from our discussion we've been talking about a number of things. One is sort of flexibility, creativity, the use of the mind to do problem solving, and on the other hand there's the aspect of intuition that's often associated with psychic phenomena and mysticism, you know, a deep inner knowing that's often even paranormal in the sense that it can't be explained in terms of conventional physics. How do you stand on that?
Well, let me give you several different cuts at that, because I think there's several different answers to that question. There's some nice, easy to understand definitions of what an intuitive process is. One is what you know for sure without knowing for certain. Kind of from a management perspective, it might be the feeling you're moving in the right direction to the degree to which resistance increases. You know, very often the direction in which you're going is, and you're getting all kinds of resistance, is a clear signal that you're going the right way. One manager, I think, gave me probably the nicest applied definition of the process that I have heard, and that is that it's a product of good training, education, and experience, all divided by insecurity and the fear of being replaced. And there's a lot of wisdom in that if you think about it for a minute, because I guess what I saw in that was that very often there is a sense that intuitive does not have a factual base to it, that factual accumulation of information. There's often this sense that intuitive means, as you're suggesting, psychic or paranormal, and I'm kind of more inclined to say that the intuitive process is in large part also factually based. That is, that it's information and experience that you've accumulated over time that may seem like a quote-unquote aha experience, but that you may retrieve instantaneously from something that was from 30 years ago, but in fact has been part of the expansion of your consciousness and awareness, so that you've gotten to the point that you've recognized and a new understanding. So that becomes the breakthrough, or what appears to be the shot out of the dark that may not really be quite so shot out of the darkish at all.
It sounds like what you're saying there is intuition is something that you know because of who you are.
I think that's true. I think it's also knowing what you're not yet, which I think requires a capacity to be comfortable, which is part of that executive's thing, you know, with the fear of being replaced, that recognizing what you do have, but also being comfortable enough to pursue the unknown. It's often referred to as the faith trip versus the white knuckle flight. Being able to enter an area that you know for sure without knowing for certain where you're going, as opposed to, let's say, a more typical process that often happens in organizations is being lost but ahead of schedule, where people are secure because they're going through all these steps that they're comfortable and familiar with, which may be totally in the wrong direction.
Yeah. I almost feel like I'm talking to one of those ancient Chinese philosophers here. It's like there's a sense of paradox about all of this.
I think there is a sense of paradox about it. I think there's a meaning in it too, in a one world sense, if you will, that organizations of all types are becoming global in focus now, and I think part of the intuitive process means a merging of the Eastern world and the Western world, and the group consciousness that will come from that is, I think, a greater understanding of the intuitive solutions that we need for our everyday life.
Now, since you mentioned the merging of the Eastern and the Western world, you've done some research in terms of people's various ethnic backgrounds and how they score on personality tests that show the development of the intuitive side of the personality.
Right. Well, actually, what's been interesting is that Asian managers have tended to be more intuitive on average than, let's say, typical United States cultural-based managers. We also have quite a variation by ethnic background in terms of Hispanic, Black, also by sex. And I think part of that is, there's a lot of research that's been unfolding that suggests some of the answer to that is actually physiological, that there are some differences between the sexes, for example, and the connections between the left and the right side of the brain, and so on, that would partially explain that. But I also think it's a good illustration of cultural cueing and conditioning, that which is again linked back to the consciousness and the intuitive process, that what one learns or doesn't learn is partly a product of the chute that they come through, both culturally but also personally. And if you are not getting the cues that expand your consciousness enough so that you have the capacity to take advantage of what you may know for sure without knowing for certain, then you also have to start taking that plunge into the waters of the unknown to get there yourself.
As I looked over your data, and I think this is with several thousand people in the field of business, I thought that the strongest difference was between men and women.
That's correct. And I think there's some interesting messages there too that are, right in recent years, the growth and ascent of women to positions of influence and power suggests that women are going to be the source of a lot of the intuitive leadership necessary for the age that's now emerging.
And as women enter into the workforce in greater and greater numbers, I suppose they bring with them this intuitive style, which we all have to accommodate to, and hopefully with good results.
And in part, I think that's the case. At the same time, we also have had a reverse trend that some women, in order to make it for a period of time, often they often started to take on roles just like the macho manager. They felt, well, I've got to act
prove
tough.
themselves.
Yeah, and so I've got to act tougher than I. And so very often they got into suppressing their talent, precisely in the ways that men did in times past. So they're kind of experiencing a reverse trend in some ways too. So I guess the message there is not to lose the talent and strengths that they have by making the same mistakes that men have made.
Now, we just have a couple of minutes left, but I want to pin you down a little more about the definition of intuition. I think it's probably fair to say that there may be dozens of different mental abilities that get lumped together under intuition, and I think maybe occasionally some of those do fall into what parapsychologists have studied under the rubric of precognition, extrasensory perception, and I know you've had some experience and done some studies in this area, and I wonder if you could just speak frankly about that aspect of intuition.
Well, I think there's a number of gifted executives that either early in life or later in life went through the door of this portion of intuitive talent. I think there's many levels of intuitive talent. This, what's often referred to as parapsychological, is one aspect of that. They've often been threatened by that and have tended to suppress it. I had one executive, for example, who came to me after a workshop and said that he wanted to go and have dinner and he wanted to talk about, he didn't really say what he wanted to talk about, but he finally got to the point that he was concerned about these experiences that he'd been having. And he pulled out at his hotel room a big file of articles and things that he'd been collecting over the years on this subject. The biggest thing that I found out of all that, and that's where I got my idea of the Global Intuition Network, was that there are executives in organizations of all types who are very insecure with these experiences, and rather than being proactive about the talent, what they've often done is gone and suppressed it, and then they've lost a lot of what can be a key there. So yes, I think there's some practical use and value there.
It's as if that side of life has kind of been like sex or like our own personal finances. We all think about it a lot and have a lot to do with it, but it's not to be discussed publicly. And you're out there spearheading a whole new movement in the field of business for people to find this side of our lives acceptable.
Correct, and I might say that it's not only in business, but it's in government and in educational institutions. It's part of my view and belief that we need to train at the K-12 in the earliest grades possible a comfort with the intuitive process, and to encourage teachers and students to get in touch with this skill and to support each other, because I think they're later in later years they're going to be much more comfortable with the very things you just got through mentioning.
Weston Agor, it's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
And I'd like to mention for those of you watching now that we will have an additional hour of discussion with Weston Agor, going into greater depth on the intuitive processes and methods of training as part of our Inner Work videotape series, which will be packaged and available for purchase along with this interview. Weston, thanks so much for being with me.
Thank you.
And thank you for being with us.